most importantly for our purposes today, David was an expert witness for the defence of the so-called Colston Four during this very newsworthy trial. So, David, we'll dive straight in, I think, and ask, what did the case actually hinge on? I've heard from various people who were nowhere near the courtroom on the subject of what the jury were really thinking and what these verdicts really represent. But as someone who was not only present but also contributing to the process, what was at stake and what was at the heart of this court case in your view?
Well, at the heart of the court case was a question about whether history matters, whether history is relevant to these discussions. The prosecution's argument was that this was a very simple case of criminal damage, and it didn't matter in their contention that this was a statue of a man who was involved in the enslavement and the killing of thousands of people. And the defence wanted this to be a trial in which history was at the centre, because you can't understand and we can't make sense of what happened in the summer of 2020 unless we appreciate that this was a targeted political act against a man who was validated and whose career was celebrated in Bristol in the full knowledge that he was a mass murderer.
So, and celebrated, of course, the statute went up, I think, in 1895, long after the abolition of slavery. So some of the arguments rendered, at best anachronistic, at worst ridiculous. How do you respond to fears, and some of the fears will be sincere, albeit very carefully stoked by people who possibly aren't sincere, fears that this offers some sort of carte blanche to all of us to tear down any public monument we might not like the look of?
Well, it's fascinating that the people who will say that they're defending Britishness and British values and the rule of law don't actually understand anything about the law in England and Wales, because this is a jury trial. Legal precedent is not established by the decisions of juries. This is an individual case. It was heard on its merits. It was fought and debated keenly in court. And on this case, this is the decision of an English jury. I'm sure there are people who are appalled by the decision, but there's lots of decisions made by juries that we disagree with. We tend, however, to respect them because we tend to like talking about our judicial system, how ancient it is, how unique it is. On this occasion, many of the people who are slightly fanatical about talking about Britain and British values seem to have attacked the absolute cornerstone of the common law.
I mean, it's a remarkable contradiction that you describe. I can lean towards finding it almost comical, but of course that detracts from how serious the matters under discussion are. Were you surprised by the result?
I'm a pessimist, so I'm always surprised by good news. I'm really, really pleased for Bristol, the city that's been my home since the late 1990s, because I think this and the toppling of the statue itself, these are moments of purification. Bristol had got itself in a terrible mess. The Victorian elite who put that statue up in 1895 did so in the full knowledge that Edward Colston was a slave trader. They just didn't care. And what they did accidentally was they created this lightning rod for this debate from the 60s onwards, when the history of slavery and the slave trade became better known. This crisis that they created by creating this cult around this mass murderer, meant that Bristol's had this sore, this cancer in the centre of it, and that cancer's now been removed surgically. And the people who did this, we should be, in my view, grateful to them. These are extremely brave young people who care, who read, who learn, and who think, and who found that statue outrageous, offensive. And the thing which is also, I think, really significant here is that this jury heard over 2 weeks the detail. They heard the history, not just of Colston, but of the strange cult built around him in the 19th century. And they heard it from witnesses in Bristol. They heard it from experts. They didn't hear it from the tabloids or through links on Facebook. Unmediated, when confronted with the complexity of this story, this was their decision.
And that's the point that we'll finish by driving down, I hope with your help, a little deeper into, because it's a question of proportionality and a question of specifics. It's this particular statue at this particular time. It's not a verdict about our freedom to attack public monuments in general. It's a question of whether it would have been proportionate for these four people to be convicted of criminal damage for tearing down a statue of the man you've just described as a mass murderer. Do you appreciate? And obviously, I deal in sometimes the more simplistic corners of the British media. Do you appreciate how hard it can be to convey that nuance in easily digestible terms?
It's really complicated, and I have to say I don't fully understand the sophistication of the legal case that was mounted by the defence. I just played my part in it. But in essence, what they have achieved in doing is pointing out that there is another offence that's been committed here, an offence to decency, an offence to the people whose ancestors were enslaved by Colston and men like him, and that offence was live and real and legitimate. That people who are the descendants of enslaved people, to live in a city in which the actions of a mass murderer are validated and glorified through ceremonies, through names, through statues, is offensive, literally, as well as metaphorically. And this court case has recognised that there was another injury here being caused to real people and their real emotions rather than to a hunk of bronze and marble.
So it's almost as if you were to commit a crime to prevent a crime, the court would look upon you quite sympathetically and quite warmly. If I were, for example, to punch somebody who was mugging somebody else, there'd be a sort of... that's why you have trial by jury, so that suggestion can be properly processed and then adjudicated upon.
Well, it's interesting. From the moment this happened, there's been attempts to reduce this to thuggery, a favoured word of the tabloids, and it's never added up. To reach this statue from where the Black Lives Matter protest began, the crowd had to walk past the statue of Queen Victoria, which they managed to get past without damaging or molesting. Then they had to walk past the statue of Edmund Burke, the philosopher, and targeted only the statue of Edward Colston. All the shops around where that statue stood, none of them were damaged. No windows were broken. No graffiti was pasted. This was targeted political action, and it came after decades of peaceful attempts to have this statue removed. This is a result of frustration, because Colston has its defenders. There are people in Bristol and elsewhere who've taken it as their duty to defend a mass murderer, who think that the act of removing his statue is a worse offence than his terrible murderous crimes. And I think today, what happened yesterday, is that their decade-long campaign to delegitimise the complaints and the grievances of people who are offended and hurt by that statue, that campaign was dealt